We may have just gotten the answer as to exactly how Usopp becomes a brave warrior of the sea, because in chapter 1142, we see that the Gods Knights somehow brought all these kids' drawings to life in what's being called their nightmare world. These are the things that they fear most. And now there's obviously a lot to say here about how these powers work and what it could mean for Emu or the Gorosei or even Blackbeard, since you know he is the guy who's tied to dreams yet doesn't sleep, and these kids are sleeping on their way to the ship, but I'll cover that in more detail once we learn a bit more in the coming chapters, so make sure to subscribe for that. But I wanted to cover what this could all mean for Usopp's role in this arc, because I think where this might go is pretty compelling. Because what better way for Usopp to become known as a brave warrior of the sea than to conquer the greatest fears of the children of Elbaf, to defeat some of the greatest evil myths and legends that Elbaf has come to know. This sort of thing makes a lot of sense to me because the resolution to Usopp's dream has always been a bit less clear-cut than some of the others amongst the crew, like finding the One Piece or finding the All Blue or making a map of the world. We pretty much know exactly what needs to happen for each of those dreams to be accomplished. But Usopp's dream isn't completed as clearly or cleanly as the rest. I mean, how does one even officially become a brave warrior of the sea? Well, one requirement, I think, is obviously Usopp internally believing that he's become one and having that sense of confidence about himself. But I do think there's a very important second requirement, which is for the people of Elbaf to believe it as well, if not the entire world. Usopp needs to do something that creates a common acceptance among the people that he is indeed a brave warrior of the sea. Because legends like that in One Piece are often born after some type of grand heroic action that is then attributed to somebody specific and spread across the masses. And while this is usually based in reality, they're often not 100% accurate either. I mean, Usopp being named God Usopp for beating sugar is a great example of this, or even think about Luffy in Dressrosa, where even though they knew it was actually Luffy who saved them, they still built a statue to Luffy. Or even in Wano, where they teach the kids that Joy Boy was the one who saved them from Kaido and not Luffy. This isn't necessarily meant to deceive everyone entirely, but on one level it does protect their identity a little bit, but really this is just how legends or myths are born in the first place. Yes, there was a hero back then worth looking up to, but their understanding of it wasn't perfect. And then as time goes on, it's what people believe in and share as the truth that ends up creating a legend. And we've had two examples in the story that are just like this that connect to Usopp very closely, with the first one being Sora, Warrior of the Sea. Now, Sora is implied to be a fictional hero from a comic strip in the North Blue, but so was their enemy Germa, who obviously ended up being real. So I think Sora probably was or even is a real person. And the fact that they're called a Warrior of the Sea has to matter, I think. And the way they kind of earned that epithet or became known as that was because a comic was made that spread that information far and wide. So maybe Usopp needs to achieve something so great that comics are made of him as well, which would fit in really well because, you know, these monsters are already kids' drawings and Usopp is a great artist himself, so there could be a lot of fun outcomes here. I mean, perhaps after Usopp saves them, all the kids draw comics of this brave warrior that saved them, which then starts his own legend. But that idea ties to the other example here, which is equally important, which is Noland the Liar, because he was not a liar, but because that's the story that everyone's been told and there were even books written about it, everyone believes that as the truth. And he's somebody who ties to Usopp very closely, right? Both he and Noland were botanists. Usopp even lied about being related to him, which means it's probably true, and Usopp is an actual liar, which makes them such a great juxtaposition to one another. And that whole idea reminds me of a great video that I saw from Hidden Island about this very thing, which I highly recommend you go watch after this. But I want to take those same ideas and tie this all back to the monsters that we just saw in chapter 1142, because the true beauty in what Oda did here isn't just making them drawings, because Usopp is an artist. He didn't just make them various myths and legends, because Usopp essentially needs one to have started for himself. He made those things be the kids' greatest fears. And one of the most core tenets to Usopp's character, since all the way back in Syrup Village, is overcoming his own fear. And that's a big reason why he wants to be a brave warrior of the sea in the first place. Despite putting up this facade that he's already brave, that he's already a warrior with 8,000 men following him, that he has conqueror's haki and all of this other stuff, he is, at his core, a fearful person. He is not a brave warrior of the sea, at least most of the time. Because as we've seen time and time and time again in the story, Usopp will be scared and run away from danger until his friends are in danger. Until he knows that he has to put aside that fear in order to protect others. I mean, think about when he fought Chu during Arlong Park. He was so terrified that he faked his own death. And then he could have just left, but instead he reflected on everyone else's sacrifices. How everyone else was able to put aside their fear. So with legs trembling, tears and snot everywhere, he told Chu to come back and fight him. Or even during Dressrosa, Usopp was about to leave after Robin was turned into a toy, but the Tentada kept calling his name, calling for their legendary hero. Which of course was a total lie on Usopp's part, of course, but as he kept hearing their calls, knowing full well that they'd keep calling until he showed up or they died, he came back and said that he'd become that legendary hero even if he dies trying. And even versus Perona, he was getting beat down by Kumasi, but remembered how if he lost, Perona would then be able to take out the entire crew. So instead, he got up, gave him the old salt trick, and found out where Perona's real body was. Even when he put the Sogeking mask on after that, he told himself, "You are a man that can do it when needed." And we even saw this kind of similar thing during his introduction back in Syrup Village. He was terrified of Kuro and his crew, but since he knew he had the Straw Hats with him, who were willing to put their lives on the line, and he had to protect Kaya and all his friends in the town, he found the courage to do what he needed to do. Usopp is always scared until he cannot be scared anymore. All of these moments are when Usopp is truly brave. And one of these is even what helped him be called God Usopp, while he was being held by Haberdine, no less, who is obviously a giant. And so I think that with the onset of these kids' greatest fears coming to life, we can now see how Usopp finally has a path to becoming known as a brave warrior of the sea. I think he'll have to help these kids out by either defeating these monsters outright, thus becoming a legend in their eyes, or maybe even helping the kids defeat these monsters themselves by overcoming their own fears, by helping them be brave like he supposedly already is. I mean, it probably isn't a coincidence that we're hearing about people's fears on the very same island that Big Mom is tied to, because she could use Soul Pocus to take your soul as long as you feared her. One of the drawings here even looked like Big Mom, and we have Zeus's ugly cousin up here too, so we know that she's going to be relevant to this arc. And her powers especially so because of Mother Carmel, who actually had that devil fruit first, and who obviously took care of all those orphaned kids here, some of who likely went on to be God's Knights or Cypher Pole agents. So the fact that God's Knights are back and are targeting the kids right away is sadly kind of part of the theme with Elbaf. But I think that part of Usopp's role here is to then inspire them to be brave and fight back despite all of their fears. Basically like he did for the Usopp pirates back in Syrup Village. This will then lead to the kids respecting and admiring Usopp as a sort of legend, thus making him known as a brave warrior of the sea by the people of Elbaf. And I do have quite a few ideas on how that could go down that we'll discuss throughout this video, but I do want to point out that it should not surprise anyone that Usopp would be the one to help defeat these kids' nightmares, because he's already had a few opponents in the story that were children. Obviously, Sugar is one of the most classic examples of this, and Usopp even beat her twice, although she is technically 22, it's just that her fruit makes her look 10 years old. And did you know that she's Monet's sister? I always thought that was really crazy. But the most insane part about the Sugar fight is that Usopp also used a drawing of himself to play off of her fear of him. It's almost like a microcosm of what's happening right now in Elbaf. And I think Kanjuro's powers are a really good parallel that we should look at for what's going on right now. But then we also have Miss Golden Week as an example, who Usopp was key in countering. We also had Bo Huang and Wano, who Usopp captured with Green Star Devil. And then maybe one of the crazier but lesser known examples is when Usopp made all of the giant children in Punk Hazard fall asleep when they were raging by using Sleep Star, which is pretty crazy now, of course, because we might have to help giant children wake up here during Elbaf. So if there was one person among the Straw Hat crew that would be perfect to help battle these kids' nightmares, it's unironically Usopp. But there is another fight that I think is really, really important to consider here as well, and that's Usopp's battle against Perona, because he was the only one who could fight her since he was already so negative. And if Usopp's going to become a brave warrior of the sea at some point, I think it might be because he does something that only he can do. But maybe the even bigger thing here is that we also saw Perona remotely controlling herself as a ghost while she was sleeping in her room. Her real body was the only tangible part, the only part that Usopp could really do damage to. But she could also have a separate version of herself appear while the main body slept. And now, while we have a lot to learn about these nightmare creatures, obviously, it seems that the kids sleeping is a crucial part of it. I mean, all of them are snoozing as they walk to the shore. And so I think what we're seeing now on Elbaf is a pretty similar thing, where the kids need to sleep in order for their nightmares to appear separately in the world. And I bet that Usopp is eventually going to be the only one who's able to figure out how all of this works. And now we did see Saul defeat one of the drawings already in a single punch with that snake, but the ones at the end of the chapter seem to be much, much larger. So I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of how dangerous these things can be. And I think it's really important to remember that these ones are kids' drawings. The monsters that they actually see in their nightmares are probably much, much more terrifying. These drawings are just kind of their best attempt at drawing them, but aren't all that close. So I think we're definitely going to see more and more powerful things as the arc goes on. And I mean, maybe they even just go to the library and use the literal images in the textbooks that the kids saw in the first place. Because it's not like they dreamt them out of thin air, right? They probably learned about these things in school, and if the Gods Knights can go find those literal same images, then they might have much stronger things on their hands. And I could also even see some of the drawings on the mural coming to life, which would be its own crazy plotline. And with the way that this one dragon was positioned, I think we have a pretty clear parallel between that one and dragon number 13 from Punk Hazard, which Zoro ended up decapitating, and a pretty clear parallel to Ryuma, I think. So I wouldn't be surprised if Zoro ends up killing this dragon as well. So just like how Saul defeated one of the monsters already with that snake, I don't know if Usopp will have to defeat like every single one, but you know, if they can regenerate, kind of like we saw with the Gorosei, or if the Gods Knights can just keep making more and more monsters by drawing more and more stuff, I think Usopp is eventually going to be just the one who figures it all out and stops it for good. But I still do have to wonder if at some point in this arc, Usopp will have to face off against his own greatest fear before he's able to save everyone else from their greatest fear. This might even prove to the kids that it's even possible, which will help them fight back, and it would show them how brave Usopp really is. And just like the kids did, I wonder if Usopp is going to be the one to draw that fear in the first place, because since he's great at drawing, it would probably be a lot more accurate and thus more powerful. So what would that fear be? I think that's kind of the ultimate question here. And generally, I think the answer to that would be like letting people down, or not achieving his dream, not being a brave warrior of the sea. But you know, given the context that this is going to have to be something that people draw, I think it would have to be an actual creature or an actual person, like an embodiment of the things that Usopp fears most, an embodiment of him not being a brave warrior of the sea. And I can almost see Oda doing this for the entire Straw Hat crew as well, where they all have to conquer their greatest fears during this arc. For Luffy, it might be losing his Nakama, for Frankie, it might be losing the Sunny, and in a lot of the arcs in the story, the crew usually gets wrapped up in people's strange abilities like this, like how some of the crew became zombies during Thriller Bark, or how Robin was turned into a toy and Law and Luffy almost were, or how Miss Goldweek hypnotized Luffy and Mr. 3 had some of the crew on the Candle Tower thing. It's a pretty consistent thing. Oda loves to have fun with these different abilities. So I think we're gonna get some kind of nightmares for at least some of the crew for sure during this arc. And I was considering going through all of those in this video, but I didn't want to get too off topic. But if you would like a video on that, then I will do that if we get 5k likes on this one. But as for Usopp, I think the thing that he fears most is a brave version of himself. The version of himself that he wants to become. The version that has 8,000 men behind him, that has Conqueror's Haki, and maybe even the man who is known as the Sniper King. Imagine Usopp draws Sogeking, so we literally have Usopp and Sogeking in the very same room. It would be a beautiful way to expand on that long long running gag since he'd literally get to come face to face with him. And the reason why him being Usopp's greatest fear makes so much sense isn't just because Usopp would be drumming himself up, like, here's what I could be if I was serious kind of thing, but it's because Usopp is afraid of becoming that. He doesn't believe that he can actually be that. It's almost like an imposter syndrome thing. I mean, if you look back to when he fought Perona, he was down on himself until he put the mask on. Then he got serious and figured out how to beat her. He even talked to himself like there were two different personalities, and the Sogeking one was kind of hyping him up, saying that you're a man who can step up when needed. That's the version of himself that Usopp wants to be, but he's scared to attain it. That's why he treats Sogeking like a totally different person. And you know, I think Usopp vs Sogeking would make a lot of sense to happen in this arc in general, because we might already have Luffy versus a version of Nika, and Loki versus another version of Loki. There's a lot of mirror matches that could already be happening. And I didn't know where else to include this in the video, but I thought it was really important. But I've mentioned Thriller Bark a lot up until this point, specifically in regards to Perona, and I've mentioned it a lot in several of my recent videos, but I gotta say, it's really important to mention here that we did meet Nightmare Luffy during that arc, who was a much more powerful form. So here, maybe this drawing of Sogeking could almost be like a Nightmare Usopp in some ways, although it may not require shadows exactly. And now, while Usopp facing off against this drawing of Sogeking could be really fun, since Usopp would get to prove to himself that he can be greater than the Sniper King, or greater than this image of himself that he's built up into his head, like he's capable of being everything that he's pretended to be, I do think there's another really fun angle here, which is that Usopp and Sogeking actually team up together. Remember earlier when I said that Usopp beat Sugar with a drawing of himself? Well, we almost have the same thing here, and back then, that image was literally his weapon. It was his key to beating Sugar. So if we were to kinda take that up a notch during this arc by having a full-blown Sogeking come help us out, that would be pretty amazing since he'd basically be our weapon there as well. But at least from what we see right now, it does seem that the kids need to be asleep for these things to appear, so we might only be able to have one of Usopp or Sogeking out at a time since Usopp would be asleep. But even that entire idea basically just reminds me of what we saw in Film Red. Because if you recall, Uta wanted to basically send everyone into a dream by using her music, where then we almost got like parallel worlds, and you had to beat Tot Musica by hitting it in both worlds at the same time. You needed people on both sides to be aware of what was going on and to work together. And like I said, since Saul took out that one snake in like a single punch, I'm not sure we're gonna have that same exact situation here. It doesn't seem to be quite as hard to beat these things, at least from what we've seen. But regardless, I think the parallel fits really well since these kids are sleeping, and we are going off against these dark, evil myths that remind me a little bit of how Tot Musica was summoned in Film Red. So perhaps the reason that Usopp even draws this version of Sogeking in the first place is so that there are two versions of them that can then be in each of the parallel worlds. It might even be a necessity in order to save everyone. Maybe Sogeking sticks around in the real world and defeats all of those monsters by himself, but then Usopp falls asleep to summon that Sogeking so he can go into the dream world in an effort to save the kids directly. And I honestly think Oda could combine this idea with Usopp fighting Sogeking, because perhaps he has to fight him and defeat him and conquer his greatest fear before Sogeking's even willing to listen and help him in this plan. Now, obviously a lot of this idea could change depending on how these powers work, but I just thought that Sogeking making a triumphant return made so much sense during this arc because it has been way too long since we've seen him. And if this is going to be Usopp's arc, the one where he finally achieves his dream and becomes a brave warrior of the sea, it almost feels like the right time to surpass Sogeking and for Usopp to become the true Sniper King, kind of getting some closure on this entire Sogeking situation. And another reason why is that this arc has already been so heavily based around the idea of masked individuals, or those who are hiding their true identity. This is something I did an entire video on recently that some of you might remember, because whether it's the fake gods that we met at the start of the arc, one of which was literally wearing a mask in Roto, or the Cypher Pole agents who typically wear masks that have come from the House of Lambs in the past, or even this God's Knight with a mask, who I bet is this kid from the orphanage back then, there's a lot of Elbaf ties to masked individuals, even including in a more general sense, like in terms of masking their identity, because of people people like Mother Carmel, who was believed to be a kind nun, but she was obviously a human trafficker. So there's really no better place for Sogeking to return, and for Usopp to discover his true self as a brave warrior of the sea and not hide behind that mask anymore. And now, if none of that happens, and Usopp doesn't actually draw his own fear or anything, and it's not Sogeking, then there is always the possibility that it's just Usopp himself that defeats the monsters and gets the credit. And I think that's its own compelling thing, because Usopp definitely needs some combat hype during this arc, right? He needs some kind of upgrade. I mean, he was clowned on even at the very start because he couldn't handle the first creatures that we found. And I did do a video talking about his potential power up this arc already, and I know a lot of people are ready for him to get a hammer, like Ragnir potentially, which is currently in the hands of Loki, but I think there might even be a more simple answer as to how he does this. An answer that we kind of already saw towards the end of Egghead, and that's hockey. Probably even Conqueror's Haki. Because as we saw, Joy Boy's rope was able to send back the Gorosei and cancel their summoning. And since the Gods Knights got here thanks to those very same circles, and these monsters may even be born from a similar process to the Gorosei, since you know they were mostly yokai, and most of these things are Norse mythological creatures, maybe Usopp almost does the same thing and sends the Gods Knights and all those monsters back, giving Usopp like a grand display of his strength that everyone can remember and make legends out of. It almost kind of reminds me of how Mother Carmel ended the fires of Elbaf in one fell swoop by using Pandora, and she said it was thanks to the sun god. So this time, maybe Elbaf will be saved again, but instead it's going to be Usopp, brave warrior of the sea. And I think Usopp getting Conqueror's Haki could be a hot take for a lot of people, and you know, given Usopp's portrayal over the last, I don't know, 400 chapters since he beat Sugar, I really can't blame you. Because he wasn't even in Whole Cake, he did nothing during Wano essentially, he did nothing during Egghead essentially, and he's looked pretty weak since Elbaf started. He's got a lot of work to do, but this arc is where it happens. And the thing is, he lied during Wano about having Conqueror's Haki, so it's gonna come true eventually whether we like it or not, and I think this arc is the place. But either way guys, I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this idea, so make sure to comment below, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. But that is it for this video today guys, so until next time, later.